Hi everyone, Joseph Koensgen here. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I'm going to be starting this large 5-foot wide painting that I have on the easel behind me here. It's going to be of a pod of orcas underwater. Now, I've never done something like this before, so this video is going to be both about me showing you what I'm doing and how I'm painting it, as well as my own journey of figuring out what to do, tackling some of the challenges that might come up, and my own learning as I try this new and very ambitious painting idea. So with that, let me show you the colors I'm using, and then I can get started. For this painting, I'm going to be using Mars Black, Titanium White, Ultramarine Blue, Phthalo Blue, Alizarin Crimson Permanent, and Cadmium Yellow Light. For my brushes, I've got quite a few. I'll start with my Filberts, a number 12, a number 10, and a number 8. And for my round brushes, I've got a number 5, a number 4, a number 3, and a number 2. Alright, so I'm going to start by blocking in the orcas first. So I'll start with a darker bluish color, a bit of Mars Black, some of the Titanium White, and then I'll add my Ultramarine Blue and a little bit of Alizarin Crimson. This color actually turns out to be not quite right, but that's okay. I'm going to sort of show you my process and some of my thoughts and experimentation with my color mixing here. So I can test this out on this first orca, and this color is definitely too gray. It needs a lot more blue. So I'll just add quite a bit more ultramarine to this one. Just get it a bit more blue than that. I want the ocean to be quite blue, and so all that reflected light that's going to be on the animals is going to be quite blue as well. So I'm going to start by doing a really simple block in for all of them. And the reason that I'm starting with the orcas first is that I think it'll be a lot easier to get the layout of them a little bit better. If I need to change something or move something around, it'll be a lot easier to do before the ocean is painted, especially with the way I think I'm going to have to do that. And I also think that this will give me a little bit of a better sense of what color I should be mixing for the ocean. How deep that blue is going to be, how light and how dark it's going to be from the top to the bottom. And so I think this will just help give me a little bit of a better sense of painting the ocean color. So as they get lighter in the background, I'm just adding more white and more ultramarine blue to my mixture here. And what I want for this painting and for the feel of this painting is for it to have lots and lots of depth. I want that ocean water to feel kind of cold and murky, and so what I want to try and do is build in a lot of depth by having all the orcas fade into the distance. So starting with that large male that's in the foreground, and then having each one getting lighter and lighter as they get further away. Now that's going to be a lot of balancing of the color and a lot of balancing of the different light that's coming down from the surface of the water, but that'll just be some really subtle color mixing and experimentation as I go on throughout the painting. Now this painting is quite large. It's 32 by 60 inches, which is going to be a lot of surface area to cover, so this painting took me about 4 weeks to do. But I think the size of this painting is really going to lend to that feeling of being underwater with these animals and watching them move past you as they kind of fade into the distance in this deep blue ocean water. Okay, that's a really good start for a basic block-in of all these orcas. It's already giving me a little bit of a sense of depth, and I really like the position and the layout of all of them swimming off to the side like this. Now on to the ocean color, and I'll start with the darker color at the bottom, so a bit of ultramarine blue, some titanium white, just a touch of alizarin crimson. I kind of want it to have a slight purple tint to it. We'll try that out. And I think that looks a little bit too light. Okay, and I'll just darken it with some more ultramarine blue, tiny bit of black, and then I can test this one out. Okay, I like that much better. And so now I can start with my Filbert brush and I can start just filling in this bottom area with my darkest blue color. What I want to do with my ocean color is I want to start with this darker color at the bottom, and I want to have a fairly strong gradient that goes from this dark blue all the way up into a lighter blue that maybe has a slight greenish tint to it. And what I'd like to have with this blue is something that's got a lot of depth and quite saturated, but I want to make sure that I find the right balance with those elements. I want to push that color depth as much as I can, but not so far that it gets to the point that it looks unnatural. Just something strong and vibrant that also feels real. I also want the gradient to have a slight arc to it so that it's higher in the middle and a bit lower on the sides. In the ocean pictures that I was looking at for some inspiration, I noticed that some of them were a little bit darker in the middle than they were on the sides, and so I just wanted to try that in this painting to see if that was something that could work for this one. And then I'll just move the painting over to the other side. This will be a pretty common thing throughout the entire painting because it's so large. I've got to move it around a lot to get the section in front of me that I need to work on. I'll often have to do a couple of coats just because I like to paint quite thin so that the painting has that nice flat and smooth look when it's finished. I'm very happy with that first blue ocean color. I think that's a really great start to this background. So for my next color in the gradient, that's a little bit lighter than the one I did before. We'll start with our ultramarine and a bit of titanium white. Get a nice blue color here. And I'm going to add just a touch of the cadmium yellow light to give it that slight greenish color that some ocean water has. Now the cadmium yellow light can be pretty strong, and I think I've added just a little bit too much here, so I'm going to just try and bring back a little bit more of that blue color by adding some more ultramarine. And then I can test that out to see if that's the right color for the next step in the gradient. And I'll let that dry for a minute. Okay, and it's still not light enough, so I'm just going to lighten that up a bit, adding some more titanium white. And it's important to add a little bit more blue with that because the white is going to dull it slightly. So I want to keep that saturation with that lighter color by just bringing in a bit more ultramarine to this mixture. Okay, and I can test this one out as well. And I think that's about where I want this one to be. Then I can start filling in that next layer that's above that blue color. Just being mindful around the edges, around the orcas. And I'm not going to paint right up to the edges. I left a tiny little bit of a gap around the orcas so that I know where the edges are and I can overlap that from the edges of the orcas when I finally paint them in later on. Following that same arcing contour where it's going to be a bit darker in the middle than on the sides. And I'm going to have a couple brushes going at once here. I'm switching to my round number 5 right now just to get into some of those little spaces that the larger Filbert can't get into. And when I have a couple of brushes going at the same time, it's important to just keep dipping them in water every once in a while so that the acrylic paint doesn't dry out on them. Now that I've got my second layer of my lighter blue color done, I just want to soften this edge and bring it down into that darker blue color. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to take that same color I was just using, and I'm going to draw the paint out really, really thin. I don't want very much paint on my brush, and I just want to get a thin coating of paint on my brush like you see how I've got it here. Then what I can do is I can start slowly bringing that color down into that darker blue color. And because the paint is going to be very thin on my brush, that thin layer is going to allow the darker blue paint to show through underneath. Then as I build up the layers, making sure to keep my thinnest layers towards the bottom and my thicker layers towards the top where that hard line is between the two colors, it should blend this all very nicely together. This is the same method that I use to paint mist or fog, and I have a video about that, which I will leave a link in the description below. And I will be doing this a little bit different than how I do the mist in that I'm not going to create such a smooth, crisp gradient. I want this gradient to be a little bit blotchy because in the ocean you're going to have all kinds of little sea creatures and algae and different things and just a lot of particles floating around. And so being a little bit more loose with my brushwork is going to give it that slightly cloudy look, and I think it's going to add to the realism of this painting very nicely. It's also going to be helpful to not have to be so precise, considering that most of this painting is going to be done this way. A lot of dry brushing with small amounts of paint, building up thin layer after thin layer, softening all those hard edges into that nice gradient, or for where the highlights are going to roll off into the shadows on the orcas. For my next lightest color after that one, I'm going to start adding some phthalo blue to my mixture. And this will change the color of this blue just slightly. I kind of want to push it a little bit more into that green or slightly turquoise color now that we're getting closer to the surface. The phthalo blue is extremely strong, so I'm only adding just a tiny bit at a time until I get the color to where I like it. And I think that's pretty good right there. Then I can start filling in that next layer. And I changed my approach here a little bit because the first two layers that I put down didn't seem to be getting as light as I wanted them to be for how far up the painting I was getting. So what I decided to do from here is make sure that I had all my colors established, layer after layer, until I got to the top of the painting, and then I can soften all those hard edges. What I noticed with those first two colors is that I was trying to be too subtle with the color mixing, and I was probably going to run out of room by the time I got to the top of the painting if I continued to do it this way and not be able to have the lightest color that I wanted for that part that's closest to the surface. This way I can mix the exact colors that I want to make sure that the gradient is as strong as I want it to be. Having a greater difference in values like this can make it a bit more challenging to soften those edges. So it's going to take quite a bit more dry brushing and probably some very subtle color mixing to help bring all these colors together. But this way I'll know that I've got those colors right and that I've got the gradient right, and I won't have to go back and either lighten or darken my colors once it's all finished. So just continuing on with this color, painting around the orcas, making sure that I've got a nice even coverage on this color layer. Okay, and I think that looks really good. I'm much happier with the lightness of that third color, and it's really starting to go in the direction that I want it to. For the next lightest color, I'm just going to use some of my previous mixture, adding a little bit of titanium white, and then my phthalo blue, and a little bit of ultramarine, a touch of the cadmium yellow light, and then this is where I can add just a little bit more of the phthalo blue, just to very slightly push it more and more towards that slightly more greenish turquoise color. Then I can start filling in that next layer, And now that I'm getting pretty close to the top of the painting, I'm not going to have such a thick band of each one of these colors. I want the gradient to rise a little bit sharper as we get closer to the surface. These orcas are not that deep underwater, so I want the way the light looks in this painting to feel like we're just under the surface. I'm also going to have a very small section right at the top where we're looking at the underside of the surface of the ocean. And so just continuing on, filling out this lighter blue color, going around the edges of all these orcas, making sure that I've got that color nicely filled in. With some of these larger paintings, there's just so much surface area to cover. I want to make sure I've mixed enough paint and to just have a bit of patience as I do the very important part of making sure I've got all these base colors as a good foundation for when I start detailing and blending all these colors together. And then for my lightest ocean color, I'm going to use a lot more titanium white, some ultramarine blue, and I'm going to add quite a bit more of the phthalo blue for this one just to bring it more towards the green side of the blue rather than the purple. And to make it even just a little bit more green, I'll add a touch of my cadmium yellow light, and I'll add just a little bit more of the phthalo blue. I don't want that yellow to be too overpowering. I want it to be almost unnoticeable with this color. So I'll just fill in this top layer with my lightest blue color that's right next to the surface. I'm leaving a space at the top because that's where I'm going to add a bit of a darker color for the underside of the ocean. I feel like showing a little bit of the waves underneath is going to give us some context about where the orcas are in relation to the surface of the water. And here you can see a lot better the difference in the colors of the orcas at the top versus the color of the ocean that I have, where it's just got that slightly different tone to it. But that's okay because later on when I paint the orcas, all those colors will be fixed and matched towards the color of the ocean. And then for that final top layer, this color is very similar to one of the darker colors that's just below my lightest color. And this darker color is going to help all those little wave shapes stand out quite a bit better than if it was against my lightest color, which is just below this one. I'm just keeping this area very small. I want these waves to be very slight. I don't want them to take away or distract from the main subject of this painting. One last thing I want to do is mix up a darker blue color with mostly ultramarine, a bit of the alizarin crimson, and a bit of Mars black. When I stood back after painting all those layers, I noticed that the gradient at the bottom wasn't quite dark enough, so I wanted to mix a color that was just slightly darker and put it just in the center just to deepen that blue color down at the bottom. This happens quite often where I don't have the full context of what the painting needs until a lot of the parts are painted, and then I notice that certain things will either need to be lighter or darker or more saturated. Alright, there we go. I've got all my orcas blocked in and my ocean colors blocked in, and now I can work on softening all those edges. Now, at this point, I was only feeling okay about where the painting was right now. I felt like I had lost a little bit of that feeling of depth with how blocky it looked with these hard lines, and the orcas being not quite the right color. But I knew I needed to stick with it and just blend all those colors and all those layers. Sometimes with larger paintings like this, when I'm tackling a bit more of a complex thing like a gradient that covers almost the entire painting, it can take quite a long time to see results, just because each part takes so much longer than if this painting was a third or a quarter of the size. I just need to be patient and take the time to break it down step by step until slowly all these elements come together. So right now, I'm doing all that dry brushing and just scrubbing those very thin layers of paint, one color into the other, remembering to keep it random and loose so that it has that blotchy and murky feel that the ocean has. And one thing to keep in mind when I'm doing this throughout this part of the painting is that because I've got the paint so thin on my brush, it's going to have a tendency to dry on there really quickly. So I'm periodically washing my brushes a little bit more than I normally would, just to prevent the buildup and drying of paint, especially towards the base of the brush. For some of these lighter colors, I noticed that it was more beneficial to mix a color that was in between the two of them and then bring some of that color up into the lighter color and a little bit down into the darker color. In some of my experimenting, I noticed that I got a much more seamless blend when I did it this way instead of bringing the lighter color down into the darker color. This part does get a little bit tedious because you're doing the same thing over and over again for what took me about 2 to 3 days to do. I'm loading my brush a lot more frequently with these thin layers of paint. So I just work consistently and steadily. I listen to some music, I put on my favorite TV show, and then slowly work to just try and make all these lines disappear. And again, just keeping in mind to keep my brushwork nice and loose and nice and random. Again, what I really want is as little paint as possible on the brush so that I can get a really thin layer of paint over top of all these other colors. Now, doing it this way can be a little bit more time consuming, but I really like the amount of control that I have over where the colors are, how deep they are, and how much I want to fade them into each other color. The further along I got with this, the better it was starting to look, and I was also starting to feel a lot better about how it was looking. Having all those colors and layers brought together really started to make it feel like it was an underwater scene, and that I was going to be able to build in all this great depth with all these orcas fading into the distance. So with all my colors softened and my layers blended together, I'm very happy with how this ocean color has turned out. And I've got this really fantastic gradient that is now my ocean background. For the first orca, I'm going to mix up a darker color, starting with my Mars Black, Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of Phthalo Blue, some Alizarin Crimson, and I'll just lighten it up a little bit with some Titanium White. And then I can just try this one out and see how it looks. Okay, that's not too bad, but I think it needs a little bit more blue. So I'll add a little bit more of my ultramarine and just get it to that nice blue color that's going to match the ocean background a little bit better than my first color did. And then I can start in with this dark color, which is going to be the base color for all these darker shadow areas. So I am starting with this large male orca that's in the foreground. It's the one that's closest to us, so it's going to be quite a bit darker because compared to the other orcas, we're looking at this through much less ocean water than we are the other ones. So it's going to have more contrast and more color saturation than the other ones. So I want to start with this one first to establish that darkest value that's in the painting. This way I can use these darker colors as a bit of a guide to figure out how much lighter I want the other orcas to be. And the reason I like to do it this way is that if I know how dark my darkest color is going to be and how light my lightest color is going to be, I can establish a nice variation of values in between those two colors. Whereas if I started with just my lightest color, I don't have any reference for what my darkest value should be, and by the time I move forward in the painting with all these different orcas, my darkest value might be a bit too light or a bit too dark from where I want it to be. Now for a slightly lighter highlight color, I can add a bit of my titanium white and some ultramarine blue to my previous mixture. And then I can add that next highlight color, and I'm going to be building a little bit of a gradient on the backs of all these orcas, just like how I did the ocean colors. Sort of one step at a time and one lighter color at a time. Then I can just pay attention to my edges, make sure that my edges are nice and refined. And with this lighter color, I can already start paying attention to the shape, trying to give it that rounded look, where some of the light is going to be falling, like on the fins here. And I can even use this lighter color on the other fin, on the other side of the orca, just to subtly push it back into the distance. And then around the edges of the dorsal fin, establishing that really strong shape. The dorsal fin on these large males can be up to 6 feet tall. So aside from their very distinctive black and white coloring, the large dorsal fin also gives them that really iconic look. Now for the next lightest color, a little bit more titanium white, a little bit more ultramarine blue. And just adding a little bit of water just to keep my paint nice and fluid. And then bringing that slightly lighter highlight color onto the back of the orca. And then I can do what I did for my ocean colors and dry brush this down into my darker shadows. Again, still paying attention to the shape and the contour of this animal. I really want it to look three-dimensional. And so paying attention to the correct shape and the correct proportions of the animal is going to be an important part in making it look real. So continuing on with the dry brushing, slowly softening those edges, just trying to get that shape to look just right. And then I can go in with my round number 5 and just refine those edges. I can cover up that little gap that I left that's exposed the white gesso underneath. And again, softening any hard edges that I've left. And then just a little bit lighter still, so some more ultramarine blue, a little bit more titanium white. I don't want this color to be too light, so I'm only adding just a small amount of the titanium white. Then I can use this color as my top highlight color for the back of the orca. And again, this time using my round number 5 just to get a little bit more precision with the edges. And then onto the top of the tail to establish a little bit of that structure. And just slowly building up that highlight here and there, sometimes adding a little bit more where I think it needs to be, and trying to get that highlight to just roll off nicely into those shadows. And what I'm going to do now with that same highlight color is I'm going to go around all the edges of the orca. This is going to slightly soften those edges and kind of help just ever so slightly blend them into that ocean background. That murky water is going to slightly diffuse some of the light, so I just want those edges to not look too crisp or too sharp. I kind of want it to have a little bit of a softer feel. As well, I think this little detail really does help set the animal into the scene. And then just around the dorsal fin, I have gone down to a number 2 round brush for doing this particular detail. It's going to give me a little bit more control over doing a finer line. And then onto the top of the orca. And then just a subtle detail for the blowhole. I don't want that to be too prominent, just enough of a detail to show that it's there. And then down around onto the fins. And again, filling in some of those white spaces that I had left from when I painted the background. And now I can move on to the white parts of the orca, and I'll start with the underside of the head, and the shadow at the bottom here is going to be quite dark because essentially we're not getting very much light coming up from the depths of the ocean. Most of the light is coming from the top down and a little bit of reflected light from the sides. So these white parts are going to be quite blue, almost the same color as the ocean around it. And then with finding the right balance just for the highlights, they should stand out quite nicely against that blue background and against the black parts of the orca. So I'll just build up those highlights really slowly. I don't want to get too bright too quickly here. And I'll just get it slightly lighter than the background color. Okay, that's starting to look really good. I like the color and the value. The amount of highlight looks good. And I think it's really starting to come together now. And then onto the white parts that are on the top of the back and the side. Going to be the same thing with that very strong blue color. Except the one on the top will of course be a bit lighter because all the light is going to be coming down from the surface, highlighting that one right on the top of the back. And similar to how I did the ocean, I'm just going to keep my brushwork a little bit more loose. And then just working on that shadow, remembering to keep it quite dark for the underside, where we're not getting a lot of light coming up from the bottom. Then I'll just bring a little bit of that highlight onto the back where sometimes you get a little bit more of that lighter color extending beyond that white patch that's right behind the dorsal fin. And then I'm just going to take some of that same background color for the ocean and just fill in a few of those gaps that were a little bit too far above the outlines of the orca. So I'll just clean up a few of those edges, make sure it looks good. And I think that's great for that first orca that's in the foreground. The color looks great. And I'm pretty happy with the way that looks so far. The next one I'm going to paint is the one just below the one in the foreground that I just finished. And it's a bit farther away, so it's going to be quite a bit lighter. I will start out with a bit of a darker color here as I try and figure out exactly how light or dark I want it to be. It's going to be roughly the same process that I did for the one in the foreground, except that there's probably going to be a lot more dry brushing with these ones that are further and further into the distance. I'm going to constantly be adjusting and experimenting with how light or how dark these ones should be. So I'm going to be standing back from the painting fairly often to make sure that each orca that's in the background has the right value for how far away it looks. That's going to be a really important element in building in all that depth that I want this painting to have. So I will show you most of the orcas that are in the background here, and it may get a little bit repetitive from this point as we work on each one, doing roughly the same thing and highlighting them in the same way and adjusting all those values to make sure that they all fit together in the scene. So here I'm just adding a little bit more of some lighter colors. You can see that I've decided to go just a tiny bit lighter than that base color that I first started with. And the nice thing that I can do with this one, because it's down at the bottom where that ocean color is the darkest, I'm able to have a highlight just on the top here that's going to stand out and be a bit brighter than the ocean background. Just trying to keep a little bit of that randomness in that highlight color just so that it looks like a bit of uneven light. For the tail, I'm actually going to lighten it up quite a bit. I felt like it didn't look quite right the way it was sticking out from behind the fin of the foreground orca. So I'm just going to lighten this one up more and more until it's almost completely faded into the background and it just has the right feel. Then onto the white patches, in the same way having that nice saturated blue color. These ones can be a little bit lighter and will look a little bit lighter just because we're down at that darkest value with our ocean color. Trying to keep the contrast not as high as I had for the foreground orca. And then just bringing a little bit more of those highlights onto the back, making little adjustments here and there. And then the brighter highlight in this white spot. We're kind of looking at this a little bit more top down, so we do see that slight separation between the white patches right behind the dorsal fin. And then just another little touch up, just bringing in some of that highlight, softening a few of those edges. And then cleaning up that little gap where the gesso is showing through just on the edge. Okay, I think that looks great. There's some really nice separation there, and it does look like that one is quite a bit further away in the background. And now I can move on to this group over here, and I'm going to start with these two, this mom and this calf. They're only just a little bit further away than the one in the foreground, and so they're going to be just a little bit lighter. And I can use that one in the foreground as a bit of a gauge to make sure that I've got the value right. Just blocking in my darkest shadow color first. And because they're roughly the same distance away, I can use the exact same colors on both of them and paint both at the same time. And now that the details are getting a little bit smaller, I'm starting to use more of my round brushes, my round number 5 and number 4. And then I can get a bit of a finer line for the tail and some of those other details. And then adding that next highlight color, which is now going to have more blue in it as they start to get further away. We're starting to get a bit more of that ocean water between us and them, and so the further and further they're going to get away from us, the more they're going to be influenced by the color of the ocean, almost like we're looking at it through some kind of blue filter. And again, using some more highlight color just on the edges to kind of soften it against the background of the ocean. And then I can just keep lightening up some of these parts to make sure that they have that right feel for being in the distance. I can start drawing this color down. Here I'm using the same dry brushing technique, except now I'm using my round number 5. And it is a little bit more difficult with the smaller brush. You're not covering as much ground, but this way I can have a little bit finer details than I can get with the larger Filbert brush. Then the same thing onto the calf, doing a little bit more of that dry brushing. And with this dry brushing that I'm doing here, I'm just using a little bit more of a softer touch. I'm not scrubbing the paint into it quite as hard as I was with the Filbert brushes. Then a bit of a brighter highlight just on that top edge. And this highlight is not so bright that it's going to get lost in being the same color as the ocean. I still want there to be that distinct shape and separation from the top of this orca and the ocean behind it. And then I can just lightly bring that color down. I've thinned my paint down with a little bit more water for some of these highlights, just so that I can use a little bit more of a delicate touch and be just a little bit softer with those details. For some of these white parts, I've started mixing in a tiny bit of the phthalo blue to match the background color of the ocean that I have behind these ones. The higher up in the picture that they get, the more they're going to start being against that background color that I wanted to start shifting more in towards a greenish hue. So I spent a little bit of time mixing my colors for these white spots to match that slight greenish tint the closer that the orcas get to the surface. And then another little highlight just a touch brighter on the top of the back there. And then on to the next one. This one's going to be just a little bit lighter still. And this is where we're going to start entering into where it's going to become a little bit more repetitive. I'm sort of just doing the same thing over and over again, doing the same techniques, only slightly lighter, pushing them a little bit further in the background, experimenting with those highlights, trying to match that background color. I really love doing paintings like this where there's multiple animals that you can use to build in all this distance and depth into the painting. And even though this can become a little bit tedious and repetitive, the end result is going to be great, especially since this is how you would see them in nature. So I'm just going to keep lightening this one up. I started a little bit too dark and it looked like it was on the same plane as the other two that I just painted. So I want a little bit more of that separation, especially where the fin is just slightly in front of this other one. And then on to the white spots on the back and on the side and under the belly. And I'm down to my round number 2 brush because this one's quite a bit smaller and I want to get those finer details. I'm also not going to make the highlights on this one quite as bright. And then a slightly darker color just to soften these edges. And maybe just bring a little bit more of that highlight color onto the back. Just lighten it up just slightly. And then occasionally, if there's a bit of excess paint on there, I'll just use my finger to dab it away. And then just to make some final adjustments until I think I've got all the detail and the lightness just right. Okay, I think that looks great. Now that I've got those 3 painted in, I'm really starting to get a better sense of the depth, and I'm getting a much better feel of how this painting is going to come together. Now moving on to this one that's behind this tall dorsal fin. And the placement of this one in my composition was very intentional. I wanted to have an orca further away in the distance behind this tall dorsal fin. I've found that having something that's a lot darker with more contrast in the foreground, partially blocking something more faded and distant in the background, really helps give a strong sense of depth. Similar to looking into a misty forest, where your closer trees are darker and your further trees are a lot lighter, and that difference in value can give you a much greater sense of the separation between the two, especially if you have your darker trees that are partially obscuring your lighter trees that are further away. So I'll just continue on again with my dry brushing, bringing that highlight color down into the shadow. And this one started out a little bit too dark, so I'm just lightening it up here to make sure that I do get that feeling of separation and distance. I think I'm going to go still a little bit lighter here. When I stood back, it didn't have quite the lightness that I wanted it to, so just experimenting and making a few more adjustments. And I just needed to slightly adjust the shape of this patch that's behind the dorsal fin. Then just a bit of a highlight. And then I'll just clean up some of those edges, some of that gap that's showing the gesso through that didn't quite meet the edges of the orca. Now onto these two that are really close together and they're a little bit further away. And if you've stayed with me this whole time, thank you for your patience and thank you for joining me. There's only 4 more to go, and we're getting closer to being done. And with these ones where we're starting to get a little bit more towards the top of the painting and to our much lighter ocean color, it's a little more tricky to balance that highlight against that lighter ocean color. If I just followed the normal gradient for the darkest orca in the foreground to the lightest in the background, I found that it wasn't going to look quite right because the context of the much lighter ocean near the top meant that I needed to make the orcas quite a bit lighter than I would have expected. This way, with these much lighter colors, I think will help give it the perception of being further in the distance than the orcas that are in front of it and the ones that are also against the much darker blue towards the bottom of the painting. Then I can start doing this white spot that's on the back. And I'm going to use a little bit of that highlight color on the back just to kind of lighten things up. Try and keep that very soft feel to it. Like I said before, I'm constantly adjusting these colors. I stand back, I make sure that it looks okay, and make sure that it looks light enough for how far away they are. And now it's starting to come together a lot more. With each group of orcas that I add, it's really starting to bring the whole thing to life. So here we go, on to the last 2, and these ones are going to be the lightest out of all of the orcas because they're the furthest away. And especially that top one that's just above this one, I really want it to fade into the distance. So a bit of a lighter color here that I'm using as my base. And then I can start adding a much lighter color. And this is where I think I'm going to try and have some of the lighter colors almost the same color as the ocean, just so they get that feeling of disappearing into the distance. Again, trying to match that color of the ocean with a lot more phthalo blue mixed into these highlight colors than I had for some of the other orcas. When the colors start to get a little bit lighter like this, it can become a little bit more difficult to maintain that saturation. The more white I'm adding to my mixtures, the lighter the colors become and the less saturated that they are. So I may come back after this and just do a bit of a glaze to bring back some of that blue saturation so they don't look so dull and so that that color really does match the color of the background ocean. And then just refining some of those edges with my highlights. Again, making sure that the shape and the proportion looks correct. Then I can go over onto the white parts. And something that I'm going to try here is to not make these white patches too bright. In the same way that the black parts of the orca are being dulled and lightened by the ocean water in between us, I'm going to keep these a little bit duller and not so bright. I think having the highlights a little bit more muted is going to be a small detail that's going to add to the realism of the scene. I may experiment a little bit with this, a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, until I get it to a place that I like. So I'll try this highlight color and see how that goes. Extend it down onto the back. That seems to look pretty good. I'll use the same color up on this one here, where it almost blends it right in with the background. Just lighten up that dorsal fin just a little bit. I kind of want this one to feel like it's almost touching the surface. And just a few final touches to make sure that it's light enough. And I think that's looking really great. With all these orcas painted, it's really come together how I envisioned it. There's a lot of great depth, and it has this really great dynamic that I wanted. So with just a few more details, this painting is almost done. So now I can start adding some of those wave details, and I really think just this subtlety at the top of the painting is going to give it a little bit of context. It's going to feel like we're just under the surface. Now I don't want these details to be too strong, so I'm going to start out very light and then slowly increase the brightness and a bit of the contrast. So I've got a round number 5 brush here, and this color is only just slightly lighter than this darker layer that I have at the top. And I'm just adding in a few of these lines and different details that'll suggest a little bit of crashing waves on the top of the surface. I am sort of making this up as I go along. I have some great reference photos of the ocean, but they're from the surface. So I'm just trying to imagine what that would look like from underneath. And I just want these shapes to look nice and natural, keeping things as random as I can, and staying away from my tendency to want to make patterns out of all these shapes, especially if I'm partially making things up as I go. And now that I've got that base color in, I can go in with a little bit of a lighter highlight color and just start bringing out a few of these details with this lighter color. And I don't want to highlight too many of these. I just want to do a few so there's a bit of a dynamic between the light and the dark. I was a little bit worried that just doing such a small amount at the top wouldn't be enough, but so far I think this looks really great. It's giving it just enough context so that we can see how close they are to the surface of the water. Sometimes adding a few different details and longer lines. Adding some tiny little dots. And different little elements that I want to stand out. Next, I'm going to mix up a strong blue color, so a tiny bit of titanium white, some ultramarine blue, and my phthalo blue. I want a light but fairly strong and saturated blue, and I want it to be quite thin, so I'll water it down, draw the paint out just a little bit. Then I can add a thin layer of this blue to some of the orcas that are further into the background that I thought didn't quite have the saturation that I wanted them to. Sometimes mixing white in to make things lighter, you lose a little bit of that saturation by trying to keep things bright. So I'm just going to bring back some of that blue saturation with a little bit of dry brushing of this deeper blue color. And I think that looks great. It's really brought back some of that vibrancy. And I think that's really starting to come together now. One last thing I wanted to try was just adding just the hint of an eye for the one in the foreground. I felt like because it was close enough that we were getting a lot of contrast, we might be able to see just the indication of its eye. So I was going to try it out, and I ended up liking it and keeping it. So with that last little detail, I can finally call this painting finished. I'm very happy with the way this painting turned out. And it was quite the journey taking this one from start to finish. Blending all those blue colors together for the ocean, painting all those orcas and getting that depth just right. I've been thinking about this idea for many years, and it is so great to finally be able to bring it to life. So I appreciate you following along as I created this painting. Thank you so much for watching.